we have like completely like different approaches to our games, even though they're games that have mechs. In my case, and that's actually another different approach. I am doing a mech game, and your game. How would you classify your game, Rick? Is it would you say your Revelation Skirmish is a mech game?
No, no, I would say it's a combined arms game.
Right.
So it was purposely designed from the ground up that infantry and tanks, or just vehicles in general, will be very, very lethal. So there's not, you don't feel like it's a mech game that tacked on infantry and tanks. Those,
Which is
all
what a lot of
three,
them do.
right. All three were in there at the exact same time I was developing, and the
Yeah.
consideration was like, okay, because I started with the Republic first to design them to balance the game. So I looked at the Marines, the Mars main battle tank, and then the Sierra. Those were the first three units. They were each for their own unit class. And I'm like, okay, the infantry have to be able to hurt mechs. Okay, so every infantry unit has to be at least equipped with a laser rifle that was strong enough to at least do a single point of damage to a mech. So at least they all could do something to each other, and then kind of just evolve from there to power armor and some other things. But that was 100% part of the classification. I know there's some people who look at Revelations and are like, it's a mech universe, and I'm like, no, it's a universe with mechs, but the mechs are not king. The mechs, if you're a pilot that just walks in and doesn't really pay it, like, if as a player, I've told people, like, if you the standard game is up to 12 units per side, and you get points to be able to build your list. If you take if you take only war mechs against a combined arms list, that's the same points. Your mechs, obviously, the number of units you have to activate will be significantly less because the mechs are more expensive. The combined arms player should absolutely dominate the mechs only guy. And it's not because mechs are weak, it's just because the cohesion that you can have with the combined arms is just different than mechs only, and
Right.
how they work together. There's just, when you're surrounded by infantry and vehicles that can all just simultaneously pepper a mech to death, you can only kill so many of those smaller units fast enough from the mech's perspective to kind of keep up.
I think there's a bit of a cliche where people see, oh, that this setting has mech, so it's automatically a mech setting, which isn't the case at all. I mean, I would never describe, for example, Star Wars as being a mech game or a mech universe. It has
No, no.
walkers,
Yeah.
but they are far from being like the thing that makes the universe.
Yeah. And I know that when I was developing a lot of the, because you have to do something to promote your product. So I leaned into, especially earlier on, artwork that featured war mechs. And, well, why? Because that's the eye candy. If it's
Right.
just I guess it would be impressive if you saw like 100,000 Marines rushing something in an image. Like, that would be cool, but it looks a little bit cooler if there's war mechs involved. But then your eye gets sucked to the war mechs because they're so big and imposing that I think sometimes it probably sends the wrong message, and that's partly my fault. You only have so much budget to do illustrations and promotions with, so you have to kind of pick and choose what will pull people in. And I get comments periodically where someone's like, I like the fact that you made it combined arms. Now, Black Star is different because it's more of a like you were saying, like an arena style game. So that one, there's no harm in it being only mechs, and it actually makes more sense that it's mech focused, because you're just not going to have a squad of guys fighting a mech in an arena. Like, it's it would be a mess.
That actually presented me with a challenge, right? So it's mechs only because not only because first I wanted to do like a mech only game. Second, taking inspiration from the old Portuguese history and the European medieval history. Um, this is taking inspiration from those jousting tournaments, where a knight starts in on one end of the field and another knight on the other end, and then they run and try to basically like slam each other with like a spear and stuff like that. Jousting, and they had other types of competitions in medieval times. But
Right.
that's basically where this is coming from. So obviously, I don't want to have a squad of battle armors fighting a mech in a mech tournament. But there I have been tackling this design challenge for a long time, and you've seen how I've been like changing things and going back and forth. Where some mechs and the inspiration for some of the mechs are actually like some mechs are 15 meters tall, and then but a lot of mechs I'm finding are actually in the 5 meter, 6 meter, 7 meter tall range, and that would make it really weird. Visually, you would have some miniatures that are twice as tall as the others. That's for some people that's not a negative, but it might look weird to other people. But in terms of believability, it sort of is a bit strange. How can I justify that this miniature that is half the size of the other is actually as powerful or even more powerful than the other mech that is like gigantic? And then I didn't want to have, okay, this is still mechs, but it's a squad of, since these mechs are weaker, quote unquote. I'm not casting aspersions on anything. Um, I have a squad of these three mechs against that bigger mech. But again, that sort of defeats the purpose of a mech tournament where, inspired by the old times, where a knight goes up against another knight for the virtue of the kingdom and his house, or to win the hand of the lady or something like that. So I also didn't want to do that. So that left me with the challenge of both the scale of the miniatures and how and game balancing, and the approach that I'm taking is that I upped the scale of the game to initially it was 15 millimeter and now it's going to be 25 millimeter. So it went from in terms of European terms 1/100, and now it's 1/72 scale. But it's still there's still a little bit of flexibility there where I can maybe, okay, I'm gonna give this mech 1 centimeter more of height, and the other one I'm gonna keep at the height that it's supposed to be, so the differences aren't as extreme. So they will still have differences in sizes, but I'm trying to approximate them so it doesn't feel weird. On the other hand, through the pilot cards and through the deck of action cards, I'm going to give some of the mechs abilities to somewhat compensate, abilities and moments and actions to somewhat compensate if they are on paper, quote unquote, less powerful. So, but that's actually been a challenge in terms of thinking about how the game should, not just game mechanics, but how it should look, right? Because the way the miniatures are presented in the game makes a huge difference. And I didn't want, I knew I wanted big detailed mech miniatures, but at a certain point, if some of them start being smaller and smaller, then I have to change something. And how do I handle that change in relation to the others that were at the height that I wanted? And X-wing also does a little bit of this because not all the ships are at the same scale actually, and I only realized that when, because I don't have like the Star Wars ship sizes memorized, of course. I only I only realized that because there's a site that has that listing. Like an X-wing is 270 scale, but then another ship is 225 scale, and back and forth, and they sort of vary. Some of them are still bigger than others because that's how they are supposed to be, but they kind of try to bring things closer. And also the base sizes, even though I don't have a grid or hexes or anything like that. But base sizes are also a good way to transmit that, so to speak.
Yeah. And yeah. And
And
with
and then the final thing, which I think we didn't tackle, it would actually be more relevant for Revelations, is that Do you actually feel like in an army game, in a combined arms game, in action and in terms of believability of the lore, um, it does it make sense to have a 25-meter tall mech?
No.
Right, and
No,
then
yeah.
yeah,
Well, and when I sat down and I was like, okay, well, how do I want Revelations mechs to be? And this was across several years of kind of revisiting the topic before I got really super serious about it. And I finally, I was doing research on and off where people are like, yeah, mechs are just completely unrealistic. I disagree, but
right,
they're completely, they'll never work. They'll never not all this negative view. And I was like, okay, well, what would make it mostly believable? Well, mechs won't work in all environments. Well, why not? Well, because if everything's flat, you can see them. Anything that has a lower profile has a much greater likelihood of hitting them before they're getting hit back. So if you do enough of the hitting, you've destroyed whatever you were shooting at before they've destroyed you. So vehicles like tanks that have a much lower profile in a big open flat area have a much better time than a 18-story machine stomping through the middle of nowhere.
right,
So and I wanted my mechs to feel more believable, where they are agile enough to do what they need to do, but they carry enough firepower to be a threat to everything. And actually, sometimes tanks actually have heavier weapons depending on the faction, because the tanks can distribute the weight differently. Now, I'm nowhere near an engineer or a physicist, but I try to apply an aspect of realism when we're making a new design, and we I ended up settling on most mechs being between 2 and 3 stories. We have some that go over, but the basically, like, we're working on one mech that's going to be like 40 feet tall in universe. And the reason that I'm doing that is because that faction recognizes that that mech is there for more of an intimidation factor, and they
right,
wouldn't
right.
deploy it in a setting where there's a lot of air cover or something that could destroy it. They're going to deploy it when they feel they have a better chance of winning. So it's more of an intimidation. Okay, now that big guy is here. He's big and scary looking. It sends that fear factor through the enemy. But you know, realizing that
And
lore wise, aircraft are super deadly. So you
yeah,
have to be careful of how you deploy your mechs. So really, the mechs are used in scenarios where they're most effective, and recognizing that if you're playing Revelations, there is a much larger war going on. There's a much larger battle. You're playing a section of that battle, so you're not fighting necessarily the artillery or the aircraft. Other guys are outside of your exact battlefield. So those elements are there. They're off table, but they're there. So it's kind of like being mindful that there's all these other assets for both sides, even if you don't see them.
yeah, and you just mentioned another aspect that, again, that is congruent to the entire approach that you are taking with your universe and your game, which is the reason for the design of that specific mech is lore based. It comes from the lore, and the game follows.
Right. And I
And
think
and
it'll be a
yeah,
cool model, but yeah, the,
yeah, yeah.
the lore, the in-universe explanation applies. Why is this mech so much bigger than some of the others?
I think there's a big. I'm not a big military buff guy or anything like that, um, but I think there's a misconception that a lot of people think. There's the crowd that think Max wouldn't be feasible, and then there's the crowd that like, oh, it's the king of the battlefield,
Mm-hmm.
and BattleTech even sells itself on that premise. But the truth is the hidden truth that nobody really wants to talk about is that vehicles are really good in BattleTech as well, and MX really aren't that much of kings of the battlefield, but that's another subject. But just like just like any military equipment, they have their specifications and their purposes.
Right.
They aren't like useful in every single possible situation. If even a machine gun isn't as useful in if you are in close quarters. That's why they have pistols. That's why they have like submachine guns and stuff like that. You're not going to like a people see in these movies. Sometimes these guys in going to houses with like a sniper rifle and it's trying to sweep the house with a sniper rifle, and if the guy has a pistol, you're dead basically. Um, but because you don't have like the time or the stability to get off a proper shot with the sniper rifle in like when you're walking down the corridor trying to cover doors and stuff like that. So no one is saying that like the mech should be like dominating the battlefield in an open plains kind of scenario. No, mechs can be awesome in specific scenarios where you have like dense urban environments and you need more maneuverability, or and tanks are limited on going in like roads, or a jungle where mechs can aren't really as dependent on having like flat ground where they can like a vehicle where they can walk. um, and then the other thing is that in terms of our design philosophy, I will have mechs that are slower and less agile. Some are fast and more agile. But the reality is, a mech kind of only makes sense if it's somewhat agile and somewhat fast, precisely because it's more useful in those types of scenarios where he can maneuver where vehicles can't. So the whole this mech is super big and super slow and super tall. That thing will get killed really fast, unless you are doing it like you said, for example, for effect. It's an intimidation. It's a psychological factor. But if you're going with a 25-meter tall, super slow, not agile at all mech in an open field against like a tank, the tank will win.
Yeah, or at least the comparable firepower
Yeah.
combination of if it took four tanks to equal one mech, those four tanks are going to have a much easier time destroying that one
Yep.
mech in an open field than the mech will, vice versa, unless it has plot armor or some sort of super weapons that the tanks just don't compare.